So, hello and welcome back to Dr. Deep State. I want to bring us into an extension of the direction we've had and open up a line of thinking that I think is super important. And what's it super important to? To understanding what's going on in the world today. That's what Dr. Deep State's all about. And thanks to the internet, there is more information available and accessible than ever before. So it's a great day for the world in that respect. Unfortunately, I'm kind of targeted at material that ought to be in the university. So most of what I'm using is peer-reviewed material or good scholarship that's used ineffectively and often not at all. It's generally just eschewed from the university, especially over the last 50 years. So I began this whole series saying the last place you can really make sense of what's going on in the world today would be the university, although they're the people that are going to tell you they've got it all figured out. And probably the second place that I would not want to go to figure out what's going on in the world today is the news. And again, what we want to call it the mainstream news. Um, and you're going to find out events, but not why things are happening. So I think both the universities and the media are giving us information that, as I have said over and over again, keep us in the proverbial Platonic cave. And we are staring at cave paintings all too often. And it's hard when we do find that person that makes it to the back of the cave and sees the light, the true light that's out there and comes back. Whether we're kind of halfway between the world or we've experienced some of that light and brought it back into the cave, or we're just still in the cave and we're grinding in our heels. Um, but that's the world that we live in. And, it's nothing new because that's how, as Plato said, oligarchs rule. And Plato said something else brilliant, that if you ever see the form of government called democracy, you know what it is? It's a cutout for oligarchical rule. And it's usually in various grades of disintegration. But by and large, it's just a cutout. And so when the university system operates under these assumptions that media is something we can depend on and that the dominant form of world government is democracy, it's going to be giving you information and helping you climb up a wall. The problem is, I bet that ladder is not leaned up against the wall of truth. And so that's a funny word that we're going to get into because there's truth communities and truth sites and the truth about this subject or that subject. But I think at one fundamental and important level, truth is a transcendent concept. And so we need to dig into that very concept of that all pervasive word out there, truth. Um, and so if I'm saying the media can't do it, that's a whole nother discussion about the media. I'm going to dig in over the next week or two about public opinion and if our thoughts are truly our own and how do we know that we're out of the cave and we've broken away from that. But today, I want to um, build upon this idea of fire in the minds of men. And I want to take three excellent scholarly works from the 20th century that really help illuminate what's going on in the world today. And if I could teach this at the university, if they would let me have a course on this, I would teach it there. But it is foreboding, at least for now. But if anybody's listening to that and there's an opportunity to hire a well-experienced social scientist to teach this subject, I'm available. So until then, um, it's not a place, the university system, where they enjoy competing thoughts, no matter how scholarly or peer reviewed the material is that you're bringing to the table. Because, yes, We are under oligarchical rule, and one of the things oligarchs do is create monopolies, especially around information. And the university is just one of their monopolies. But what are the four assumptions that have dominated the university system over the last 50 years? Well, we began this whole Dr. Deep State project with some of these assumptions. And one of them, according to the university system, and I could talk about political science because they think they specialize in what's happening in the world, but really any of the disciplines at the university. One of it is if you want to know what's going on in the world, of course, you want to flip the radio on or the uh, you know television, read a newspaper, and go to a respected source of information. What are they calling it now? Real news, or go to the university and get trained PhDs that are trained in the methodologies to kind of give you critical thinking. Of course, critical thinking would mean that you're able to introduce different topics in order to critically weigh them out. But, okay, the university, the democratic process, how does that work? That the laws, the rules, what's going on in the world is a product of the people who put representatives into positions of power, and they produce the policies and the laws that we live under. I've demonstrated and will continue to demonstrate that's empirically absolutely untrue. Empirically, peer reviewed, I can go over the information that none of it does. It all affect the laws that we live under are created whole cloth by the oligarchical interests for the oligarchical interests. Sometimes they might trickle down and have effects for others, but that's demonstrably who created. So democracy, as Plato said, is simply a cutout. To some extent, it's nominal. It works here or there in some places to give it the appearance that it's, real. So if you want to introduce another model like elite rule, that was part and parcel of understanding how the world worked until mid-century. That was, of course, oligarchs were still, but it was pushed from the discourse, so that if you bring it up, especially in a job interview and situation, there's the door. There's the door. Because if you say I value truth, they're going to say, "Oh my God, he's one of those, one of those." So the democratic process is produced, and it's an open, transparent process. And of course, if you could demonstrate that a lot of the decisions that happen in private back rooms, that there's a government by secrecy, people know it's true. But of course, we're taught by the oligarchs in our cave to be double-minded. So we know it's true that real decisions happen in secret. We don't know what to do with it because we can't introduce it for critical thinking. In fact, we're programmed that if there's something about secretness, or God forbid, a secret society, we're programmed to, snicker because I guess on one of your television programs you were taught uh, consciously or unconsciously to respond in that way. So the democratic model doesn't think about that people actually collude, powerful people in private, and monopolize things like information, monopolize things like markets. No matter how true it is, we don't know what to do with it. So we pass on. It happens, but the university, this is not a place to discuss it. That's an idea with weight behind it. So we have to dismiss it without weighing it. And that's the place where the university system is at today, unfortunately. And media is even worse. So we also assume that decisions happen at the national level. Okay. So what we've demonstrated here, all the way back from Thomas Jefferson, he said, if you let these national banks into the country, the banks and the corporations that surround it will subvert any true liberty in the country. And I think he knew what he was talking about because he was, in fact, one of these corporate entities himself, or working on behalf of the corporate entity of the Anglo-American money suppliers. So we have today, this is the deep state, that it's Wall Street, these international entities that dominate the security apparatus in Washington, D.C. And that's been demonstrated over and over from good And I'll challenge everybody, go to the playlist, hundreds of lectures from scholarly people just describing how Wall Street created the security apparatus, and the corporations then would create the military industrial complex, all not reflecting the interests of Americans, no matter how much the television tells you that. It's reflecting interests of these international oligarchs and the agendas that they have. And so, what are the agendas? Well, that's why this is called deep state biopolitics, and it's esoteric eschatology, because they very much have an agenda, but it's esoteric, and we're not taught it because it's occulted. But you know what? It's all available. You just have to start getting out of the cave and putting it all together, and that's what we're doing here together at Dr. Deep State. So there's an idea that no matter how much evidence, we can say that there's zero evidence, whatever political party in whatever country, you get the same policies decade after decade, but it's bad form. Just go and vote for one of the people there in the process. So, and I think people are kind of getting on to this in the last few years, because it's getting pretty obvious, especially with new tell-all books this week about the whole Clinton thing, and that it was prearranged inside of the party. Shocker. But now, what you kind of knew anyway. Apparently, this might shock some people, but the Russians didn't actually rig the elections. It happened, through the system of the political parties, which is, a hand or a finger of the oligarchical class. So you can't talk about this in school because it would just upset people. People have been kind of trained to think by the time they arrive at school, and if they kind of are actually introduced to the challenge to think critically, they have that antagonism. They're in the cave. I'm sorry, they are. So Plato said it was, this is just how things are. It's just they have arranged society, the oligarchs, and created it from the ground up. So that will be a reaction. In the university system, they have this accidental view of history. Something happens over here. Because, I mean, if decisions aren't made at a transnational level by big hitting transnational actors that work oftentimes in sync, in concert, collude, conspire, to work together towards something, their monopolies, their further creating of this empire project that we've talked about, if you can't get into that lens, you just can't figure it out. So the lenses we give you at the university system, the ISM, here's the liberalism lens, and here's the conservative, the conservative lens, the socialist lens, and so forth. You'll never make sense of anything. Trust me, they don't. They're given to you so they don't obfuscate. That's what they're intended to do, obfuscate. Um, so that you're told, just like the people, the citizens, buy into one of these theories, buy into one of the ideologies, and they're all designed and packaged by these dominant oligarchs that have been around forever and intermingled through their alchemical breeding process to create their own master race, and master us, and that's what they do. So they figure out what information we can have in our heads and what is foreboding. Okay, so they have this accidental view of history. And if you're somebody that sort of starts to connect this with that, or God forbid, you actually look into their deep state biopolitics and their esoteric eschatology, you got their number. You can figure it out. So their only defense is that you're not taking an accident. These things, you should just be clueless and think everything's happening by accident, when you can put together a demonstrated pattern using tools of social science and empiricism. They it's not available for conversation. It's not available for conversation. There's no place to discuss it. So the accidental view of history. And if you start statistically looking, these are the policies that come out of our capitals and our democratic institutions. Why do they never match the preferences of citizens? So, and lastly, we said that in the university, just like the ethos of what's around us today, everything is material. Even though, strangely enough, when you start digging into what happens, you see that the dominant oligarchs, in fact, use what we can call biopolitics to control our bodies and our minds in a particular esoteric fashion. and their esotericism has an endgame, a teleos, an eschatology. They're going somewhere with all this. So they're operating by principles that don't assume a material universe. And in fact, what you find is this esoteric frame of reference that they have identifies the Bible. It doesn't say, um, I mean, some of their spokespeople do, but their deep esoteric beliefs identify the Bible. And what they do is create a parallel version to that or an inversion of it. And so to understand what's going on today, we have to just dig into that a little bit, and I didn't want to title this, the Bible versus this, but that is what's going on. And to take this a step further, I want to introduce three texts and I'll provide the links for you because these are just phenomenal texts that came out of the 20th century. One is James Billington, and if you want to just wiki his name, you can see that he is one of the heaviest hitting scholars of the 20th century. But he produced a book in 1980 called Fire in the Minds of Men, and I use that for the title of this series that we're about to do, Origins of the Revolutionary Faith. That word faith is in there, okay? And what is he talking about there? Well, this is a deep concept, but when he talks about, modernity is a very mushy term. But modernity, we usually think of it has something to do with a transition in human affairs. So people begin to think of the world in more scientific terms. So the age of superstition is getting pushed aside, and the age of enlightenment and empiricism and science is going to dominate, the affairs of men. But he's talking about behind the garb of this, he's especially looking at the French Revolution that's happening just after the American Revolution. Because when you really break it apart, and again, this is one of the top scholars of the 20th century, when you really break apart what was going on, what were the mechanics of who was getting power and what was their agenda, it's the same thing that's going on today. It's one project. And he's going, where did this real agenda come from? And what were they really after? And it was a type of faith. And he finds that it came out of the secret fraternities. Well, I just used the secret. So no matter how elevated this scholar is and this text is, you simply can't use that in the university because I just said the word secret societies. You can't use that. But he's saying it. The origin of this revolutionary faith that's sweeping the world began from the secret societies and their esoteric belief system. And he called it basically Jacobianism. And Jacobianism is the societies of illumination. And sometimes it's even code for the Illuminati, if you want to use that term, but it's Jacobianism. And that's the phrase. So it's an esoteric belief system. It's the belief system held by the dominant oligarchical players, especially those who control the money supply, but they're ultimately intermingling with all the other aristocracies from the ancient, medieval, and today's world. So it's an interesting idea, and its agenda is it stands in antithesis to Western biblical culture, and it wants to destroy it through nihilism and atheism, and then rebuild its esoteric worldview, sort of the phoenix rising thing that the Rosicrucians would talk about. So there would be this destruction of the culture, destruction of the family. This is what the French Revolution was all about, deracitating us from our roots, in that case, a lot of the Catholic culture, and even breaking apart a lot of the kingships to make these Masonic republics. And we don't like to talk about that in American government, but these republics, they're a great idea that Montesquieu et al. Talked about. However, they were going to be done in a form that came out of the lodges. They were technically esoteric Masonic republics. So what was going on in the United States was slightly different, but it would ultimately be part of the same project, kind of this Hegelian, liberalism over here and a little bit of socialism over there. But that's what he's talking about, fire in the minds of men. And part of this fire would be this project, and I think he's taking his title from Dostoevsky's novel entitled Demons. So it's like a demon force. And when we break apart the two eschatologies, I think that's very much, frankly, what it is at hand. It's a working of a demon network of sorts. But this is a phenomenal text, Fire in the Minds of Men's Origins of the Revolutionary Faith. That's 1981. The second text that I think is just so important to understanding in macro terms, because if we can get this down big terms, what's rolling out in the world today, we can understand all the little things that are going on as well. So the next one is The New Science of Politics. That's by Eric Voegelin, and that's 1952. And one of the takeaway terms, and I've mentioned this, I think, before in other lectures, is the immunization of the eschaton. Immunization of the eschaton. So what he's saying is a similar idea that what happened in the age of science and enlightenment was in fact underneath this, there was more of a scientism. A lot of these theories that we get that we talked about, because the oligarchs love to use abstraction, are really just repackaged esoteric beliefs that are dressed up by the big scientific institutions with their money. But at the core of it, it's just an age old esoteric belief. But Voegelin believes that essentially political regimes over the ages either have taken on the task of cracking the souls of the people and pointing them toward the heavens, the transcendent, or they have put them first here on the world. And part of this idea of immunization to make immediate the eschaton. In other words, we want to make heaven on earth. And the oligarchical rulers would therefore be masters over this realm if people aren't pointing their allegiance toward the skies or the heavens or the creator. So part of this idea then, according to, is that it's science that's used to undercut everything that created Western culture. And so again, it's part of this Jacobean project to destroy tradition, especially the biblical Western tradition, because once that's destroyed, and this was, of course, done through the Nazis and the Communist Party, so it's going to take the various tracks. But another just fascinating read, The New Science of Politics, 1952, Chicago University Press. A final one, and next week, I want to talk a little bit about public opinion, and I'll be mentioning Walter Lippmann. He's kind of the pinup guy for the whole modern concept of propaganda and the methods used to shape public opinion. And he was behind the power sources with Edward Bernays to kind of sell everything from World War I to World War II to the Federal Reserve to kind of put those ideas, the pictures in the minds of men. So he's the master of working with the oligarchical class to create the puppet shows, the image of those figures on the wall that confuse and distort. But he's going to have a very telling work that almost no one has ever read. And in fact, if you go to Wikipedia and look up Walter Lippmann, it's almost going to not tell you not to read this work from 1955 called Essays in Public Philosophy. All of these texts that I'm telling you right now, Fire in the Minds of Men, The New Science of Politics, and Essays in Public Philosophy are available on PDFs. I'll leave links if you care to read these or work through them. And sometimes some of these PDFs have little underlined points, I think, with pertinent points in them. So Lippmann is getting to right here, again, back to this idea of during the French Revolution, this sort of infection of sorts came into the body politic, into the minds of men, not by accident, not at a national level, but it was a transnational project that happened deliberately to overtake the world. Okay. And he called it Jacobeanism. And he said it took one route, it was going to be juxtaposed with liberalism. So the American Revolution would be characterized by liberalism, that is, some idea that the world was created by a creator that gave us natural rights and that there's natural law. And we should this is liberalism in a nutshell, man's law should somehow try to conform with natural laws. And that's the best society. And that's probably the pinnacle of the Western tradition that really began, I would argue, in the Renaissance. And he's saying it took one route, this Jacobeism, that would become Marxism, that would spread throughout the world through the Soviet Union and China, and pit the 20th century in the bipolar world, this Jacobean thing where the family was destroyed to the extent that the people were brought up through an allegiance to the state in this seemingly atheistic tradition. Again, you had to kind of create this material, atheistic, nihilistic world before the final phoenix would rise and would return to this esoteric belief system, the ancient pagan Gnostic esoteric belief system. And the oligarchs will unveil themselves, this sort of exteriorization of the hierarchy, as Madame Blavatsky would say in her Secret of All the Ages. This is the esoteric agenda. This is what the oligarchs want to do. They want to come out again after they've used democracy now for, it's typical how long, Plato said they last, sometimes a century, sometimes after usually a century, people are usually pretty wise that this isn't how things work. So, it's run its course. So at the universities, they know in the back of their minds this stuff isn't real, but they don't know what else to do. So they get their paycheck and they keep on teaching, you know, they keep on teaching because the numbers just don't add up. So Walter Lippmann, so we take this Jacobean direction, and the Jacobean agenda would be more subtle. You know, I hate to be crass, but Jacobeanism is it's the Illuminati. That's kind of what it is. I prefer the word Jacobeanism because you can identify its specific sources and how it would be the ideology behind communism and Nazism and esoteric Nazism and esoteric Judaism, which is most of it, and esoteric Christianity, which is unfortunately down here in the South, just as General Cornwallis told General Washington, it has infected the United States. This, he called that the Jewish religion would be taught in the universities and would be taught in the churches. And it's this, looking at Christianity through the lens of the esoteric, the hermeneutical, Kabbalistic idea of an interpretation of the Bible would be the prevalent idea. And of course, if you look at, the Southern Baptist arm of, what I'm involved in down here in the South, it's dominant. They can't get, they can only see the Bible through this very bent up worldview. And so that's why I want to get into looking at these worldviews a little bit. So Lippmann's saying, but eventually the two ends would meet. So where Billington and Voegelin, they said by the 1950s, when all this conversation gets dropped at the universities, is a time when the projects kind of almost succeeded, that men can no longer see truth because they're deracitated, they're cut off from a tradition of biblical prophecy. I know these are funny words for people, but the test for prophets was very deep. And this is what built this thing. And the project was destroyed by this competing eschatology, Jacobeanism. So it went more of a revolution, hard revolution in the East, and created, communism and Nazism. And in the West, it went in the form of liberalism, tied to its biblical liberalism, but now that's been largely destroyed. So we now have basically a Western culture that, whether they realize or not, has embraced New Age politics and New Age Christianity or New Age eschatology, which I don't think in many cases they realize exactly what that is, but we're going to dig into that. So join me for this episode here when we're going to get into these competing eschatologies, because this is what's going on in the world. And hopefully I'm not going to present for you your mainstream media or your mainstream churchianity, eschatology. I want to get into that subject through the deep state biopolitics and their esoteric eschatology, and see that juxtaposed to the biblical eschatology. And if this is new to you, I'm going to make it real basic. So hopefully you'll join me on the other side. Thanks. This has been Dr. Deep State.